Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to our lecture on international political economy. Let me start with a very quick announcement. You probably all got the email that I sent to you. I did this because I just wanted to clarify that the situation in the complément-d'études may not be optimal, but I think it's much better than what the alternative was until last week, which was we would have had complément-d'études with up to 100 people, but we want to make sure that all of you can participate more or less in the seminar. So that's why we doubled the amount of groups that we have, which comes with some organizational problems which are not easy to resolve at this stage of the semester. So please understand that it might not be optimal this, at least in the first seminar and in the second. But I think we did everything we could to make this as good as possible to allow you all to participate. So today we're going to talk about what I call the political economy of international relations. So the purpose of this lecture, of this week, is to some extent to review what many of you know already. So many of you know, or if you've taken the courses in Introduction to International Relations and in International Cooperation, some of the theories might sound familiar to you. Others of you might not have taken these classes, so it's for you, this is all new. The purpose of this is to review what's been done, how international relations developed, and so we are all on the same page from a theoretical perspective. And then that's the first purpose. The second purpose is to explain to you how much of international relations today is actually about international political economy. So the theories that you learned in the previous courses often were developed with a perspective on international economic affairs. And it will become evident when I give you the examples of major studies that have shaped international relations and how much they focus on international trade or international monetary affairs. And the third purpose of this lecture is then to put it all together at the end. We're going to talk about systemic factors that influence international political economy. We're going to talk about domestic politics, and then we're going to use this to build a framework that we're going to use in the next few weeks to examine trade, to examine money, to examine all kinds of particular problems and phenomena. That's what we're going to do. So we're going to talk about early international relations. We touched upon this already. We talked about neorealism and how it looked like, and then this will allow you to understand how international political economy emerged and why it focused on certain factors, for instance, hegemony and international institutions in the early years, mostly in the 70s and 80s. Then we moved into domestic politics, so we're going to talk about how we can divide society into different groups to understand what their interest is in trade policy, in monetary policy, in exchange rate policy, and so on. And we're going to talk about international institutions, how much they matter because they decide which group is actually influential and which one is not. And finally, we put it all together using so-called two-level games that examine how domestic factors, interests, and institutions, how they then shape international negotiations. And this leads us to this analytical framework that I talked about. So as a start, remember what we talked about last week. We talked about how international political economy emerged as a field when the mercantilists talked about how states should organize their economies and how they should formulate foreign economic policies. And these foreign economic policies were closely linked to the idea of state building that became important when sovereignty was introduced as a norm in international relations. The mercantilists were then criticized by the liberals, for instance Adam Smith, but also others, but on the basis of very different assumptions about what matters for people, what matters for the well-being of individuals. And this was then again criticized by the nationalists who aligned more with the mercantilists, saying that we have a discrepancy between the national interest and private interest. Then, with the split of the disciplines, we saw the rise of political science and political research, and in international relations, this was embodied by liberal idealism in international relations in the 1920s. Liberal idealism was then really harshly criticized by the realists, saying that all this doesn't work. We need to take into account the self-interest of nations to understand how they behave. And the most important self-interest of a nation is to guarantee its survival. Then again, in the 1970s, we saw the rise of neoliberal institutionalism. And this is where we're going to start today. I'm going to quickly review what neorealism said and why we saw the rise of the neoliberals in the 1970s. So the key question here by realists was, naturally, after having experienced these two major wars, is when does war occur? And the key assumption, we reviewed them already last week, was that the international system is characterized by anarchy, which means we do not have this overarching power that organizes the interaction of states. What's really crucial here is that states aim for relative gains. So international politics is a zero-sum game, and we saw that this is also an idea that is reflected in mercantilist thought. That if you win, I lose, or the other way around. And this idea is, if you think about war, this idea makes a lot of sense. If you think about security, if I increase my security, if I build up military capacity, you lose relatively to me, right? So my military capacity increases relative to yours. So that can be conceptualized as a zero-sum game. But if once we move beyond security, all these assumptions might not hold anymore. Another key assumption is that states are unitary actors and that they are driven by self-interest. So the central variable that emerges out of this approach is power. So power is the key independent variable in this literature. So the dependent variable in this question, for instance, when does war occur, the dependent variable, that's what we want to explain. And the dependent variable here is war. We see an absence or presence of war, right? That's what we want to explain. And they explain it, these people, or this literature, this approach explains war with power. Can one of you formulate a hypothesis? How does power influence war? What do the neorealists say? Yes.
With the balance of power, if one country tries to get bigger and bigger, the other countries will try to stop it to maintain a balance of power.
Exactly. The balance of power hypothesis says that countries try to balance the power of a state that's becoming too powerful. And they do this because the risk of war is greatest if we have unequal power relations between states. So if one state is way more powerful than the others, the risk of war is greatest, right? There's another literature, we're not going to go into depth into this, but there's another hypothesis that says exactly the opposite. That's a power preponderance theory, that war is most likely if one country rises and becomes a challenger of the hegemon, and then eventually they will fight over the dominance in the international system. We're not going to go into depth because we're not concerned with security so much. But what's important here is that we have high against low politics. High politics is everything that concerns the security of a state, and low politics is everything else. For instance, domestic politics, economic affairs, all these things that we're going to deal with today or in this course. And we deal with this with low politics questions because it has been shown, and we realized in the 1970s that these low politics factors are actually pretty important for international relations and interstate relations. And this critique was very much motivated by the cooperation that emerged in the 1970s. What you see here is Brezhnev on the right and Nixon on the left when they signed the so-called SALT agreement in 1972, the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty that limited the amount of intercontinental missiles that these superpowers could have. And so we saw cooperation, and the question now is when can we have cooperation even under these assumptions that the realists spelled out? A second reason was that we saw a lot of cooperation within the Western Bloc. And here you can look at all the examples that I gave you in the first lecture when we talked about the GATT system, European integration, monetary cooperation in the Bretton Woods system. We saw plenty examples of cooperation that needed to be explained. So the new question now is, when does cooperation emerge? Under the conditions set by the neorealists. And one person who, I just want to mention one, but I think what she wrote and what she said pretty much points to the state of the field at that time. And that's Susan Strange. She was one of the most important international political economists, political scientists in the 1970s and 80s, and she says we cannot ignore the economy anymore because we have such strong effects from the economy on politics and the other way around that it's just so important to be left aside. And the first reason is that we have those strong disturbance effects. So if we have a disturbance in one area of the world economy, let's take the financial crisis in the United States, it affects the other states so much that it actually becomes an international political issue. Then we have hindrance effects, which is international capital flows constrain states so much, the autonomy of states so much, that it actually can become a problem for democracy. So again, it's becoming a political question. And then we have those competitive policies. We talked about the mercantilist proposition to run a trade surplus. And that's one example of such a competitive policy, because that's not possible that everybody runs a trade surplus, right? If one country runs a trade surplus, by definition, some other country has a trade deficit. So we are now in this competition, who can run the surplus or not. We have the same situation when it comes to the devaluation of exchange rates. So we have competitive policies, and that means that at the time, the study of international relations is not keeping up with these changes, with these important effects. From international relations, there has only become a meager contribution to understanding international politics because they ignored international economic affairs. And on the other side, the economists' contribution to the study of international economic relations has shown political naivete because they simply ignored all the political motivations of policymakers to understand international economic affairs. So this led to new questions. And here I want to show you a bit how they relate to the classic international relations questions that you've seen in the other courses. So for instance, one big question in this literature in international political economy is, what determines the stability of the international economic system? And one argument is that the power distribution has a lot has a strong effect on the stability of the system. So this question relates directly to the question of the neorealists. How does power affect interstate relations, right? A classic international relations question. Another question is, who adjusts to external imbalances? An external imbalance simply means that one country has been running a trade deficit for a long time. So another one has run a trade surplus for a long time. So take Germany and Greece, right? One problem of Greece was that it had such a huge trade deficit. And Germany was a country that had such a huge, or still has, such a huge trade surplus. Now the question is, who adjusts, right? So this speaks to the price-specie flow model that we discussed last week by David Hume. And that now becomes a political question. Just think about the relationship between Greece and Germany these days. It's highly political. Who will adjust? Will Greece impose severe austerity, as it did, or will Germany also help by increasing domestic demand? That would be the alternative. And the outcome was that Greece had to accept a lot of austerity, while Germany did much less to adjust. So power here again matters a lot. So it becomes a political question. And this question, who adjusts, is directly related to the question, is cooperation possible, and who has to adjust more or less, right? Who adjusts and who changes the behavior more than the other? So what this is meant to show is that we were going to discuss very specific questions that point to economic relations between states, but all of them have a political component, and all of them have an equivalent question, bigger question in international relations theory in the courses that was raised already in the courses that you took previously in the Bari. So how did this all develop, and what are the different perspectives on international cooperation? So we're going to discuss systemic factors, and we're going to classify them as such. And we're going to start with the systemic theories. What is a systemic theory? So think back to Ken Waltz and his classification of international relations theories. Yes, please.
It's a theory that tries to explain an object in a coherent way.
In a coherent way, by looking at factors on a particular level. And on which level? So that's true. Ken Waltz was one of the first who tried to come up with a more theoretical approach to international relations, a systematic approach to international relations. But where did he say should we look for the factors that are crucial? So we should look at international factors. So factors that are on the international system level. That's a systemic, that points to systemic features about the international system. One of them would be the international distribution of power, which is, for us, the presence of a hegemon or the absence of a hegemon is going to be crucial. So Charles Kindleberger wrote this famous book in 1973 that's called The World in Depression, which explained why we saw the Great Depression in the 1930s, and he says it has to do with hegemony or the absence of hegemony. Another important variable is the presence of international institutions. When states negotiate and interact, that comes with a lot of transaction costs. So international institutions address these problems, promoting cooperation by reducing transaction costs, by increasing the time horizon, by institutionalizing reciprocity, and so on. And then what we saw in the literature from the 2000 onwards is the increasing amount of international law. that characterizes international politics. And again, so we see this development on the systemic level where we first talked about power, then institutions, and institutions then became promoted international law and the spread of binding international agreements. On the domestic level, what matters is obviously the interests that different voters have, but also the institutions that aggregate these interests into a policy outcome, and then the interaction between these interests and institutions on the domestic level with what's going on the international level, right? So these are the different theoretical perspectives that we're going to work through today, step by step. And you can already see how this literature evolved over time. So we started in the 1970s with hegemony. Then we moved on to institutions in the 1980s. We saw we discussed role of international law in 2000 onwards. We saw the focus on domestic interests in the 1980s and 90s. And then we looked at two-level games at the roughly at the same time. But two-level games were already mentioned by Schelling in the 1960s, so it's not a new idea, but it has been central in the international relations, but it really became important in the literature in the 1990s. Okay. Let's start with hegemony and role of power. We already saw a version last week. We talked about this already last week. I didn't call it like that. But one of the studies that I presented last week was one of the earliest ones that talked about hegemonic stability theory. Which one was that? What did we talk about? And what did it say? So we looked at the study by Krasner, who looked at who tried to explain when the international system is economically open to trade, and when it's actually closed. And what he said is exactly the second point here, that we have incompatible national interests. By Krasner, who wants to have an open system and who wants to have a closed system? Do you remember? Who benefits from international trade and who loses relatively? Yes?
The hegemonic power benefits from international trade, when on the other side, nations with small powers, they lose from international trade.
Exactly. So the hegemon benefits, the biggest power benefits. What he also said is the very small powers, the very small countries also benefit, but the intermediate countries, they lose. And that's why we need a hegemon who forces these intermediate countries to open up their markets. So that's a realist version of hegemonic stability theory. There's also a liberal version. I'm going to talk a bit more about it later. It has a slightly different dependent variable. For Krasner, the dependent variable is the openness of the of the international system, the amount of trade that we see. For the liberal version, it's slightly different. The dependent variable is the stability of the international system. Now, the two are related, but they are conceptually two different things. So you can have a stable system that's totally closed, or we can have a stable system that's totally open. So here, on the liberal version, we focus on stability. In the realist version, we're going to focus on openness. And both of them say that if we have a hegemon, then we see a stable system and we see an open system. So the independent variable is the presence or the absence of a hegemon. Then afterwards, you will be surprised to hear that in the 1970s there was an agreement among international relations scholars that the power of the United States is declining. The United States was the hegemon, and everybody agreed that the hegemonic power, or the power of the US is a declining hegemon. Now afterwards we learned that the United States became as powerful as never before afterwards, but back then we saw the rise of, Germany became stronger, Japan was rising, everybody was concerned that we're moving from this hegemonic system to a system with multiple challengers. So the question was, how could this stability persist even if the hegemon declines? And the solution was that we have international regimes. Regimes are simply arrangements, norms or institutions that help states to cooperate. And the argument was that states maintain these regimes because we need a hegemon to establish these regimes, but then they live on because the maintenance costs are smaller than the establishment costs. That was regime theory. So here's an example. So this is Kindleberger in 1973, which is the liberal version of hegemonic stability theory. So the dependent variable is the stability of the system. And Kindleberger says stability is a public good. What is a public good in general? What's the definition of a public good? Yes? Everybody can use the public good, exactly. So you cannot exclude anybody. So it's non-exclusive. And there's the second characteristic. But the non-exclusivity is the most important one, yeah? It's non-rival. Once it's there, everybody can use it as much as they want, right? Exactly. So that clearly applies to stability. If a system is stable, everybody benefits from stability, and we cannot exclude anybody, and everybody can use it as much as possible. Now, what's the problem with a public good? Yes? Exactly. We have the problem of free riding. You try to use it and not contribute to it, right? And that's why the public good is not provided, because everybody tries to free ride on the contributions of the other one. So the solution by Kindleberger is that we need a hegemon. A hegemon is a country that's really large and has a disproportionate interest in providing the public good. And here you see why this is a liberal version and not a realist version. Here the hegemon doesn't force the others to contribute. The hegemon actually provides the public good themselves, right? And Kindleberger says, for the world economy to be stabilized, there has to be a stabilizer, one stabilizer. And this hegemon provides several functions. For instance, it provides a stable system of exchange rate, it coordinates policy, it is a lender of last resort, which means that if there's a crisis and countries are having a liquidity issue, the hegemon is lending money to these countries. It absorbs those goods. Distressed goods are goods that nobody wants, so if there's an overproduction, the hegemon will absorb these goods. Do you want to say something?
Is it consistent with Donald Trump's view that U.S. allies in the international system profit from the U.S.?
In this version, the allies benefit from what the hegemon does, but the hegemon doesn't complain about it.
Yes, but it bears the cost.
Yes, so clearly the U.S., if the U.S. is the hegemon, the U.S. should be willing to provide this public good and pay more than the others. Now, what you're referring to is more a realist version where the hegemon actually doesn't want to pay all the costs and forces the others to contribute more. Exactly. Yes. So that would be the realist version of hegemonic stability to some extent. So, and to show this, these people always refer to the power relations in the international system. And this graphic or this table simply shows you how much of world manufacturing is produced by these different countries in 1880 until 1928. And we see that in 1880, Britain produced almost 23% of world manufacturing, so much more than all the others, so it was clearly the hegemon. Now Britain's share is declining down to 10%. So the hegemon, Britain is clearly a declining hegemon. The US is producing more and more and more, and is the rising hegemon. And that is taken as evidence that if the hegemon declines, then the international system destabilizes. Britain was not able to fulfill these functions, which the hegemon should fulfill, and the US was not yet ready. So we need to talk about why the US was not yet ready. We're going to talk about this in a moment. But the consequence is the British inability to lead and US unwillingness to lead, and we talked about the Smoot-Hawley tariff, for instance, in the first lecture. And that's clearly an example that the US was not willing to fulfill these 5 functions at the time. So looking at power is one way to explain stability of the international system. Another way is actually to look at the strategic behavior. So we talked already about the public goods. And what then came up as a new approach to international relations was to look at the strategic interactions of states. So we formulate their national interests and see how they should behave. And to do this, we were relying more and more on game theory. It's very simple game theory, and you probably saw many of these, you saw some of these games before. And these games are useful because they help us understand what the problem is, why we do not see cooperation. So probably most of you have seen the Prisoner's Dilemma, right? Who has not yet seen the Prisoner's Dilemma? So all of you have seen the Prisoner's Dilemma. There's other games as well. And these games point to the usefulness of institutions. They tell us what institutions, so these games point us to the problems and then also to what institutions can do to solve these problems. And I'm going to start with the first one, which is the so-called stag hunt. And this game was first mentioned by Rousseau. Rousseau in his writings, he talked about the situation where we have, who has heard about the stag hunt before? So all of you. So you know the story, so I can go faster. You know the story. We have 2 hunters. They can both hunt the stag and then get a big animal, or they don't cooperate, then they will not succeed in hunting the stag. But alternatively, they could alone hunt a rabbit. So this is the preference order, right? So they both prefer that they both hunt the stag. So this is what hunter A does, and this is what hunter B does. The best outcome is they both hunt the stag. The second best is they alone hunt a rabbit, and the other one hunts the stag, so they don't need to share the rabbit. Or they both hunt the rabbit is better than that I hunt the stag and I fail because the other one hunts the rabbit, right? We give utilities to these outcomes. We put it into a 2x2 matrix, and then we look for the Nash equilibrium. What is the Nash equilibrium in this game? Remember? Let's quickly do it. I'll use this great instrument here. So this is stack hunt, right? And what I hate this. So what we're going to find is a Nash equilibrium is a situation of mutual best responses. And to find the best responses, we simply assume that this hunter A goes for a stack, right? So now we're looking at the best response of hunter B. So hunter B can choose either to hunt a stack as well or to hunt a rabbit. This first number is hunter B's utility of hunting a stack, and this one is hunter B's utility of hunting a rabbit. So it has a choice between 3 or 2, right? So we're going to choose, obviously we're going to choose 3. Now let's assume hunter A chooses to hunt a rabbit. So now hunter B has a choice again between stack or rabbit, 0 or 1. So we're going to choose 1. So now we look at the best response of hunter A, given that hunter B hunts a stack. So what's hunter A going to do? So can hunt a stack or rabbit. The second number is now the utility of hunter A. So hunting a stack gives you 3. Hunting a rabbit gives you 2. What are you going to do? You're going to hunt a stack. So now we're going to look at the best response of hunter A, given that hunter B hunts a rabbit. So what's hunter A going to do? Going to hunt a rabbit, you're going to get 1. Good. So what you see here is we have 2 mutually best responses. So in this box, so that's a Nash equilibrium. We have 2 mutually best responses in this box. So that's also Nash equilibrium, right? So we have 2 Nash equilibria, which means we have 2 possible outcomes. We might end up down here, or we might end up here. Now ending up in this box is way better. We get much more, right? So we want to avoid that this is that we want to avoid this outcome here. And this is where international institutions come in. I'm going to summarize this to you in a moment. But the point is that we have situations where we could end up here or here, and an international institution simply formulates rules of behavior that we end up in the better equilibrium. So the equilibria are here, 1, 1, and 3, 3. In a chicken game, we have the following preference order. I want to defect and hope that you cooperate. And the second best option that we both cooperate. The third best option is that I cooperate and you defect. And the worst outcome is that we both defect. Can you give me an example of a situation in international relations that is represented by this game? So the Cuban Missile Crisis, exactly, that's a classic example. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a situation where the Soviet Union sent nuclear weapons, nuclear missiles to Cuba. The United States did not like that, obviously. So what the US decided to do is to impose a naval blockade to block the ships that were coming from the Soviet Union to Cuba. And Khrushchev at the time, who was the Soviet leader, he said, like, if you don't end this blockade, we're going to break through and we might end up in a nuclear war, right? So the situation was this. Defection means that you don't back down. It means you stand firm and risk a nuclear war. Cooperation means that you accept that this is not that you should avoid this, so you back down. So what happened was that the Soviet ships eventually turned around and went back home. And it looked like Kennedy won the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Or won this challenge between the two superpowers. There were hidden deals and so on, so we're not going to talk about them. But it looked like Kennedy defected and Khrushchev cooperated. Cooperation would mean that they both at the same time back down. They both agree on a compromise. That did not happen. But that's better than, so the second best option would have been for Kennedy from the United States perspective is that Kennedy backs down even if the Soviet Union installs the missile crisis. Why would that be the better outcome? Well, because if none of them backs down, which is defection, we would have a nuclear war and we would be all dead, right? So if we put this into a payoff matrix, we get this. Do you remember what the equilibria are in this game? So we have two again. We find that one will back down and the other one will, so that means one will cooperate and the other one will stand firm, which means one will defect. But it could also, but it's not clear who is going to defect and who's gonna back down. So we have two equilibria. So the prediction of the game is we will not have a nuclear war. One side will back down because we are all better off if we don't have a nuclear war. But the model does not predict who is going to back down and who wins, right? So there's a shortcoming in this model. What's important for us is that here there's a distributional conflict. One actor, in one equilibrium, one actor wins more than the other. So we're going to fight hard over which equilibrium we're going to end up with, right? And to facilitate cooperation, what we might need is that one actor who wins more compensates the other one. So take climate change, for instance, right? We have plenty of possible deals which specify how much CO2 reduction the different states accept. And if I accept more CO2 reductions, I lose more, I pay more than you do, right? So to accept that, or maybe it's harder for developing countries to accept this, CO2 reductions than for rich countries, depending on the industry type that you have. So what we might need is, so this is represented by such a game, what we might need is a compensation mechanism that compensates those who pay more to achieve a deal. And then we've got the prisoner's dilemma, and the prediction here is that we're going to end up without cooperation, although the cooperative situation would be Pareto superior. Here, everybody is better off than in the Nash equilibrium, right? So we should find a solution to move us from here to here, from the non-cooperative equilibrium to the cooperative equilibrium. So to wrap this up, we have different games. An assurance game, which is the stag hunt, a coordination game, which is the chicken game, but there's also the battle of the sexes. A cooperation game, which is the prisoner's dilemma. And we have different problems. In the first game, the problem is communication. In the second game, the problem is a distributional conflict. And in the third game, the problem is free riding. That's why we need different solutions. So the first game, we only need rules. We just need a rule that specifies how we're going to behave, and nobody's going to contest them. In the second one, we need rules, we need to negotiate, and then we need to compensate the loser. And in the third problem, we need also monitoring and potentially sanctioning, because we want to, even if we have rules, we need to make sure that nobody is secretly defecting and not cooperating. So that means we need to provide information about the behavior of others. Now it turns out that the that the most spectacular problems are obviously those who are represented by the prisoner's dilemma. Those are the real political problems. But there's plenty of problems which fall into the category of an assurance game. They're just not very spectacular. So can you give me an example? What would be an example of an assurance game in international relations? So yes.
International seaways. If you don't communicate in your position, well, two boats might crash.
Exactly. So you need certain standards where where the ships are going, or even in air traffic, it's the same, right? You need to specify where are the routes going in one direction or the other. Another one is telecommunications. You need to specify the frequencies and all these things. We need to coordinate on many things. They are not very spectacular, but they're really, really important also in international politics. So to give you an example, the first international organization is the international, or the oldest one is the International Communications Union, which is here in Geneva. And what this institution is fairly big. It has 5,000 employees, and what it does is it simply organizes the solution of technical problems in international telecommunications. It was established in 1870, and it's not surprising that the first institution was in this area, because it's way less political. It's really important, but it's not highly contentious. And it's much more complicated to establish institutions in this area because it's interfering much more with the interests of the different states. Good. So the takeaway point here is that we have international institutions that solve these problems. And depending on the type of problem that we face, we have different types of institutions, right? They either just set rules, or they actually engage in monitoring and sanctioning. Good, let's take a break. Come back at 11:15. Thanks.
Sorry, I'm not from a political economy background, so this is all a bit new to me. But for this one, why is that not nationalism?
Solve it exactly the way we did. Find that out. So you put the best responses. So choose three. It's gonna choose one. What's the right? Otherwise, it's gonna choose three. It's gonna choose top one. So this is the only box where we have two mutual best responses in one box. And then that means this is the national. That's the prediction of the game.
Hang on, so
So you solve it like we did. You find
Yeah.
the best response. You
Yeah.
assume he is choosing C. So what will prisoner A do? Tell me that?
choose C.
Choose D because he can choose
Oh,
3
if-
or 2.
Oh,
So he's going to choose 3, right?
right, okay.
So here, what is it? Given that prisoner B is 1. If you do the same for prisoner A, you find again that he chooses 1. The two mutual best responses. Intuitively, this one is going to defect because he fears that the other one's going to defect too. This one is going to defect because he fears that this one is going to defect. So we both know that we're better off here, but I also know that the other one has an incentive to cheat. So I'd rather cheat this way. Avoid the situation where we both cheat. And the solution is again and again. And that's what the institution does. It gives you information about whether the other one cheats or not.
Oh, but I thought it was based on the fact that
But they don't know in this period, but now it's about to play this again. I don't know. We choose our action at the same time. But then afterwards, I can see. Also here, afterwards they will learn whether the prisoner.
but then that maybe
So go to the book. So we're going to get back to this. Go to the book. Very careful. I'm going to try this. Right. So then you will. That's great about game is very explain in detail.
I realized that it's fresh outside.
I don't know how to do this actually.
And actually here you have much more air than up.
So you should all come to the front.
Ah,
No, but where is I don't. I would do that. If, I just don't know how. Stores this like.
yeah, I know. It's,
So I don't think I can. I would love to do it. Could you please take your seats? So, there was a question. Let's move on, please. Please sit down. Okay, so in the break there was a question whether this is just an analogy. So let's make this more concrete. And okay, I give you 1 more minute to sit down, please. I'd like to move on. Are you all back? Could you please calm down? Hello? No more talking? Thanks. Good. So, there was a question how we could make this more concrete. It's very abstract how I described it and how these models are usually presented. Here is an example. So last week we talked about mercantilists and that they want to achieve a positive trade balance, and one way to do this, and that's China is often being accused of this, is by manipulating the exchange rate. If you devalue the exchange rate, your goods are cheaper on the international market, so there will be more demand for them, right? So we have 2 countries, assume we have 2 countries, and they have 2 options. One option is to stabilize the exchange rate and not devalue, and the other one is to devalue, right? We have 2 countries. If you're a mercantilist, what would be your best outcome? Yes. You devalue and the other one stabilizes. We need to specify also what the other one does, right? The combination of I devalue and you stabilize. What's the second best option? Both stabilize, exactly. So we keep the exchange rate fixed. That's what it means. There's no depreciation on any side. What's the third best option? We both devalue. Here we have the assumption that, so that would be a kind of a currency war. We end up with the same exchange rate, but we're generating inflation. And the worst outcome for me as a mercantilist is that I keep the exchange rate fixed and you devalue. So you're having the trade surplus and I'm having the deficit, right? So this is a preference order. We get this game. Do you recognize the game? What is the Nash equilibrium? So this is the prisoner's dilemma. We have this Nash equilibrium, which is we both defect. We're going to end up in a currency war. But we prefer actually that we both have a stable exchange rate, right? That we both stabilize. So think back to the 1940s. This was a real concern because these competitive devaluations is what happened in the interwar period. In the 1930s. So countries were trying to develop a solution to this problem. And they came up with the idea to establish an institution that fixes this. And this institution was the IMF. So what the IMF does is it sets clear rules how countries should behave. So if you go on the IMF website, you can look up the so-called Articles of Agreement. And in these Articles of Agreement, Article 4.4 says that the fund may determine that international economic conditions permit the introduction of a widespread system of exchange rate arrangements based on stable but adjustable power values. So it sets the rules that we should have fixed exchange rates, or the fund can decide to have fixed exchange rate. Then it allows devaluation if there's a fundamental disequilibrium. So we have fairly clear rules. Now we need monitoring, right? We need to see whether countries actually follow the rules or not. And in these articles of agreement, we also see that countries should report their exchange rate policy to the fund. And the fund then publishes what the states do in the so-called annual report on exchange arrangement and exchange restrictions. So that's a classic example. So the fund, the purpose of the IMF has changed a bit. But by the original purpose in the 1940s, when it was established, was exactly to, among other things, was to solve this problem. So it's an example of a situation where we have this tendency to cheat and to free ride on the other, and we have an international institution that is designed to solve this free riding problem. Good. What is one of the shortcomings? So when you think about these models, so we set up this preference order here for state. So this is consistent with neorealism in some ways, because it assumes that the states are unitary actors, right? So we have a national interest. What's the problem here? Yes.
Both states know what the other one does, so there's a transparency which doesn't exist in the presumption.
So there's no uncertainty about the true preferences of the other ones. That was a real important advancement in international relations theory. So we have uncertainty about the others. That's one thing. And why are we actually uncertain about what the other state wants? Why could that be? Yes?
Because of the domestic interest?
So we don't really know, we might not know exactly what the different groups in a country want. And then even if we know that, we don't know what the government will do. Who will they listen to, right? So there's always uncertainty based on domestic politics. So this is exactly what we need to do now. So far, we assume there's this one national interest. That's what the real neorealists said. There's this one national interest. And we can identify that really easily. But it's actually not clear what this national interest should be. So we need to look at domestic politics to understand and develop and get an understanding of this national interest. So when we think about international economic affairs, how would you divide a society? Who are the major groups? How would you identify the key groups, or how would you split up society into different groups? Who are these groups? Yes.
The companies that export, the companies that import, there's a company and employees.
So the companies that export and import, including the company owner and the company and the employees, for instance. That's one way to look at it, exactly. Can you think of another way? So what you're referring to is to specify sectors or industries, right? So you have export-oriented industries, import-competing industries, non-tradable goods, right? Non-tradable sectors, or the public sector. They are not they're not directly affected by international trade, the financial sector, and so on. An alternative way would be to look at classes. And that's a classic way. We have labor, capital, and land. And many theories that or some of them you know already, the Heckscher-Orlin model, for instance, are based on this distinction between labor, capital, and land. So those are the factors of production. That has a somewhat Marxist flavor because we are splitting society into classes, but the predictions of these theories are actually a bit different. Now, once we have decided who the major actors are, and once we identify their interests, we need to think about how these preferences are aggregated. So who wins the battle over these policies? So let's say the export-oriented sector would want free trade, right? But the import-competing sector does not want free trade because they face competition. So now they are fighting over which policy they get, right? The one proposes protectionism, the other one proposes free trade. So who wins? Well, it depends on organizational capacity, group size, group member asymmetry, and so on. But it's very important to look at domestic institutions. And I'm going to give you an example from the United States. We talked about the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. And the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act simply is a new institution that changed how these different actors, the sectors, can influence trade policy in the United States. So that's what we're going to do now. To illustrate how important it is, we can look at this paper by, there's this study by Frieden, which directly talks to hegemonic stability theory. So the theory of hegemonic stability says that the world economy collapsed in the 1930s because Britain was declining and the US wasn't strong enough yet, right? But you saw the numbers, how strong the US was in the 1930s. It had more than 30% of, it produced more than 30% of world manufacturing. At the peak in 1880, Britain produced 22%. So Britain in 1880 was a weaker hegemon than the US should have been in 1930, right? So that's a puzzle. So why did the US not lead and take on the role as a hegemon, as Kindleberger said it should? Well, Frieden says we need to look at domestic interests. The reason was, according to his argument, is that the many or the biggest parts of the US economy were not interested in the international economy. They were only domestically oriented. They were producing for the domestic market, they were not exporting, and they were not producing abroad. They had no investments abroad. So they did not want to spend money to save the international economy because they thought it's not relevant for them. So we have internationally oriented sectors, but they are very concentrated. And they were mostly banking and advanced manufacturing. And physically, they were located in the Northeast. So around New York and Boston. So this is where these industries that had an international interest were located, but the rest of the country was mostly domestically oriented. So here are the numbers. So this table just shows you the percentage of foreign direct investment of an industry compared to the total investment of this industry. So about 18% of the investments that the mining and petroleum sector made in total went abroad. So this is a sector that was heavily involved in international, or fairly heavily involved in international economic affairs. The machinery and the motor industries, they also had, so the machinery industry had about 25% of their investments were abroad, and 15% of the investments in the motor industry were abroad. But you see that all the others, so agriculture, metals, textiles, they were not internationally oriented. They did not export much, nor did they have much international investments. But these other sectors, they constituted about 80% of the US economy. And that's why they were so much more politically important. And that's why the US did not lead in the 1930s as they should. Now, it's not the case that they did not, there wasn't any group that didn't care, right? So these internationalized industries cared, and they were aligned with a camp that's often called internationalists, right? So Woodrow Wilson tried to make the US be an active player on the international arena. So he proposed, or he was an actor who promoted the idea of the League of Nations, but then the US never joined because Congress decided not to, right? So we had an internationalist camp and we had an isolationist camp, and the isolationist camp was dominant also for economic reasons. So you see a clear link between the economic affairs and the foreign policy of the United States in general. Now with the Great Depression, all the sectors were hit massively, but those sectors that were hit most, relatively, were exactly those sectors with fewer international investments. So that meant that we see a shift in the power, the relative power, the importance of the sectors that were internationalized. They become more powerful than those sectors that were more isolationist. And that's why after the Great Depression, eventually we saw a shift in the US foreign policy away from an isolationist policy towards a more internationalist policy with the establishment of free trade agreements and the GATT system in the 1940s. So I'm not going to go through this. This is a paper by Milner, and that's the required reading for today. It essentially says the same thing. It says the same thing about the United States in the 1970s, where everybody was concerned that the US power is declining, and she asked, why do we see a continuation of an open economic policy? And she says it's because of domestic interests. Now we have such a highly internationalized US economy, and these economies, these sectors that were highly internationalized, demanded the continuation of an open economy. So I'm not going to go through this in detail. You're going to talk about this in the seminar, or you have talked about it already, right? So you're going to talk about this more anyway. I want to move on and talk about institutions. So we saw the Great Depression, and we saw that the isolationist groups became less powerful. And one example of this is the election of Theodore Roosevelt. I think it was in 1932, 34. I'm not a US specialist, but Hoover, who was a Republican and protectionist, he was not re-elected, and Roosevelt came into office. And he was a pro-free trader. He wanted to have free trade. So he proposed an institutional reform, the so-called Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. So before this Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, a trade agreement was just a standard international agreement, and how this works is that was that Congress, the U.S. Congress, proposed to reduce tariffs on trade unilaterally. So the U.S. would decrease tariffs from 20 to 10%, for instance, so the tax on imports from 20 to 10% unilaterally, and Congress would vote just like on a regular international treaty. So it would require a 2/3 majority. So 2/3 of the congressmen would have to agree with this. With the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, things look different. So what this means is that the president negotiates a tariff reduction with another country, and it has two features. The first one is that it has to be reciprocal and not unilateral. So now the president can propose a tariff reduction up to 50% if the other country does the same. And then the president goes to the Congress and says, like, look, this is the deal. You cannot change it. You can accept it or reject it. you cannot, but it now only requires a simple majority to pass this treaty. So there's no more discussion. Well, there's a discussion, but there's no modification of this agreement. So what does this do in terms of the importance of domestic groups, of those domestic interests that we talked about before? So we talked about exporting-oriented industries and import-competing industries. So this is an institutional change, and how does it affect policy making in Congress? What does it mean? Yes?
Basically bypasses the whole political preference.
So it does not. So the political preferences play out differently. It does not exactly bypass it because Congress still votes. But it's true that some political preferences are more important and other ones are less important. What did you want to say?
The industries that are more important, they can influence the majority of the Congress. It's easier for them to have a majority.
So exactly. So you don't. If you have 60% of the industries of the population is employed in an export-oriented industry, you get a simple majority, right? But you don't get a 2/3 majority. That's one thing. Reciprocity here is really important because before we had unilateral trade policy, I would just lower trade barriers or not, right? But now the other country only is going to lower the tariff if I do the same. So that mobilizes exporters. Before, exporters didn't care about my trade policy, right? I don't care about if I want to export, it doesn't affect me what the tariff is in my country. But now I care because the tariff of the other country depends on the tariff on my country. So now I go to my representative and says, I want a lower tariff in the United States because that gives me a lower tariff in Germany, right? And I, as an exporter from the United States, I care about this. So it mobilizes exporters. Reciprocity mobilizes exporting interests domestically. Plus, there is the end of what's called log rolling, which is that I vote for your tariff. So I'm a representative for Michigan. I'm voting for your tariff, from the tariff that is in the interest of a representative from North Carolina, if the North Carolinian representative votes for my tariff, right? So that's log rolling. We make a deal. Now that can't take place anymore because the president proposes a tariff and then you cannot bargain, you can agree or not. And this is the outcome. So this is just the estimated tariff level by looking at customs revenues, the revenue you generate by imposing tariffs on imports. And what we see is from 1820. And what we see is that we already see a decline in these tariffs in the 1800s. So this is consistent with what I told you 2 weeks ago, which is that we have this first period of globalization in the first half or in the 19th century. So we see how tariffs decline. Then they go up again in the late 19th century. And then here they go down again and then they peak here. This is the Smoot-Hawley tariff, right? Which is the highest estimated tariff level in the whole history here. And afterwards we see a sharp decline. The Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act was established in 1934. Then we have the war, and then we see how this effect unfolds in the decline of tariffs of the United States. Okay, so now we have domestic interests. We have this international system, we have domestic interests, we have institutions. Now we need to connect these two, right? We need to connect the international level to the domestic level. how can we do this? We can do this with what's called a two-level game. Who has not yet heard of a two-level game? Who has heard of a two-level game? So most of you have. We can the nice thing about the two-level game is we can apply it directly to what we're talking about here, right? We can apply it to, for instance, trade policy. We can apply it to trade surpluses, right? So let's assume we have this continuum, this continuous policy space where A, so the United States ideal point, that's my most preferred policy. That's the ideal point. It's on the left. And the ideal point of B is on the right. So that could be, for instance, let's say that's a trade surplus or trade balance. A wants a trade surplus of 5%, which would mean on a bilateral basis that B is running a trade deficit by 5%. And B also wants a trade surplus of 5%, which by implication means that A runs a trade deficit of 5%. That's not, so we need to negotiate what we're going to do. And actually, Putnam's famous paper from 1988 talks exactly about this problem. It talks about the negotiations at the Bonn summit, so that's a G7 meeting, in 1978, when Germany was running a huge trade surplus, and Japan as well, and the United States was running a huge trade deficit. And that's exactly what they negotiated. So Putnam's paper talks about international political economy, or applies his ideas to this question. We could also think about it, this is A's ideal point in tariff, in trade politics, is that I want to have a high tariff, and you have but you have a low tariff, or the other way around for B, right? So let's suppose we need to, we are bargaining on the international level. A and B meet in Bonn, and they bargain, and they decide on a deal. Now they need to go home and ask the parliament or voters, whoever, whether they agree with this deal. That's why we need the win sets. So this is a win set. So this is an ideal point. That's my most preferred outcome. But I can deviate from this. I can sign a compromise. So I'm deviating. And so this range here are all the possible outcomes that my domestic audience will accept. Or, to simplify it, that the parliament will ratify. So I get a majority for everything up to A. And B gets a majority for everything up to B1, right? So here, the two win sets do not overlap. What happens? There's no agreement. The agreement in A's win set will be rejected by the legislature in B, the parliament, for instance, and the agreements in B's win set will be rejected by the legislature in A. Now let's assume a different situation, this one. So the win set of B is wider. So what's the outcome now? Well, we'll have an agreement that's within these two overlapping win sets. We have plenty possible agreements. So to simplify now, we're going to assume we're going to take the agreement in the middle. Sounds fair, right? So we get this, right? T2 is the agreement. Now let's assume B has an even wider win set. So the ideal point stays the same. My most preferred policy doesn't change, but I can compromise more. I can move further away from this ideal point. Again, let's assume that we sign the agreement in the middle, T3. Now what's important is that T3 is closer to A's ideal point than T2, right? So when B had a more narrow win set, a smaller win set, B was getting a deal that was actually better for B. And by being more cooperative, or by being able to compromise more, you're getting a deal that is worse, right? That's a somewhat counterintuitive implication, which is that the more narrow your windset is, the better you're off, right? So you should try, and you can use this strategically, and this has been used a lot in international politics. You try to play the game by narrowing the windset, because this helps you to get a better deal.
Sorry, sir.
Yeah.
Can I ask, is there any scenario that player A ratified the agreement and B doesn't?
Excuse me, that?
Player A approved the agreement and B doesn't.
That would mean that we sign an agreement that's in here. Oh, A ratifies, so we have an agreement here, and B, so it's outside B's windset, so you reject it. It's within A's windset, so A approves it. So that's possible, but that's a mistake, right? It's actually useless enterprise. But it can happen because we don't know exactly how big the windsets are. That could happen, but it basically reflects this situation here. So we sign an agreement, but it's rejected, so it's exactly what we get here, right? So if governments are well informed, they would not do that because they anticipate it's not gonna be ratified. But it can happen because it's just out of because it's a mistake. Yeah.
This is all assuming that there's an international institution that enforces this cooperation.
No, there is no international institution here. There's none. So this agreement, T2, is self-enforcing. But the institution facilitates this. For instance, what an institution can do is it links issues. Now here we are bargaining about one issue. An institution in the World Trade Organization, you're going to bargain about trade in agriculture, trade in services, trade in all kinds of things. So you have different issues, and you link them. And that means that the windsets are widening. So institutions come into this game because they widen the windsets. Yeah?
But we think usually institutes lie about your windows.
To what? To?
Lie about what we are trying to say your windows, so you cannot kind of.
Well, you can lie. You try to narrow your windset up to a point that you get the best deal. But I mean, the other side is not stupid. They can observe what's going on in your country, right? They can estimate your windset as well, just as well as you can.
So if you say in there, you kind of affect the trust.
I mean, you're still interested in this situation. You're still interested in cooperation. So that means you try to narrow the windset, but not up to a point where the bargain fails. Right, so you have also an interest in not lying too much or presenting yourself as having a windset that's too narrow, because then you end up like this and you have nothing, right? So yes, there's bargaining and there's trying to, still an attempt to cheat, but here we still want an agreement. Both sides want an agreement, and that's why they don't play this game too far. That's the idea. So how does what we've done plays in here? So these windsets depend again on interests, government interests, political parties, societal groups, voters, and so on. They depend on institutions. And the best example is, so the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, for instance, is an institution that reduced the number of veto players and reduced the number of relevant interests, right? So in that sense, the RTAA increased the windset of the United States, right? That's what the RTAA did. Can you give me another example of an institution that really narrows the windset? Think about Switzerland.
The fact that we have referendums and stop everything. We have, like, for example, the case
So exactly. So the bilateral agreements between Switzerland and the EU are a great example, right? So the wind set of Switzerland is really narrow because you always need to, or in often there's a vote on this agreement, right? So the government cannot push it too far because if they push the concessions too far, it will be rejected on a domestic level. And they use that as an argument in the negotiations to get more concessions, right? Do you have another example? Yeah. Yeah, what is in the WTO? So that's the rule, that's the same for everybody, but there's different countries have different constraints in accepting these rules. And that we see in the accession to the WTO, when some countries have interests, strong interests that are against free trade and so on and so forth, right? So the rule is the same for everybody, but the wind set's different. Another example is Britain and its interaction with the European Union. Britain, as we all know, has a very Eurosceptic public, and Margaret Thatcher was using that as an instrument to getting a better deal, right? So she says my wind set is really narrow, so I get a rebate in funding in the amount of money that the UK is paying to the European Union. Okay, I'll skip this. I'll move on to what this means for our course. So we reviewed the international relations literature from the 1950s, more or less, until today. We applied it to the questions of international political economy, so the example by Kindleberger, the Great Depression, by Frieden, US isolationism, one second, and for instance, the reciprocal trade agreement sector. They are just simple applications of international relations theories or approaches to international political economy. So now we're going to translate this into a big framework that we're going to use again and again in the next session to study trade politics, and then to study monetary politics and so on. You had a question?
It was about the RTIA.
Yeah.
Increase the wind set of the US, or
Yes.
it narrows down the possibilities.
No, it increases the wind set of the US because you only need a simple majority in Congress to pass it, and you have you mobilize the groups that are pro-free trade. So it basically means before the RTIA, the wind set was small, and that's why the agreements failed. And now the wind set becomes larger. So how can we put this all together, right? So imagine you want to you want to put this all together, right? Where would you start? So you want to analyze the relationship between Switzerland and the European Union. What's the first thing you need to identify? So we have Switzerland, right? So this is Switzerland, and here we say the EU is one country, right? So where do we start? Yes?
From national interest.
So we need to identify the interests of of Switzerland. Can you read this? No? Like this. We start with interest, right? In Switzerland. So we identify what's the attitude of different sectors towards European cooperation, to having access to the European market, right? What is the ideological cleavages that we see in this country? So what is the interest of different political parties, and so on. We do the same here, right? So what are the interests of the different member states? Who wants to have Switzerland in? Who doesn't care about Switzerland, and so on. So that's the starting point. What's the second step then? Well, we want to see how this influences policy in Switzerland, right? And we do the same for the EU. But what's important here is that institutions matter a lot, right? And institutions are so-called intervening variables. So the institutions of the EU decide how the interests of the different member states are aggregated into a common EU policy, and the institutions of Switzerland decide how the interests within Switzerland are aggregated into one policy position, right? So this is now the aggregation of different interests into a national interest. And now we're going to see how this interacts, how they bargain. And that's a two-level game, right? So that's a bargaining process between Switzerland and the EU. So you formulate, so you can really see this nicely in the interactions between the EU and Great Britain. The EU always says, like, we don't know what the policy position of Great Britain is in the first place. So Britain has produced now these policy papers, and they were the intention of this was to define the ideal point of Britain. And that for a long time was unclear, because the interests, there is so diverse interests within Britain that many people want to remain in the EU, 51% want to exit the EU, and then within those who want to exit, the interests, some want to have access to the common markets, some say we don't care, we just want to restrict immigration. So we have all these interests, and they need to be aggregated to an ideal point, which is already fairly complex. Then we have these ideal points, and then we interact in a negotiation, in a two-level game, right? The British government and the EU government bargain, keeping in mind what they can pass in the domestic parliament. That's what this is all about. So there's one last thing that's missing here. What have we talked about that's missing? Yes? The international system and two features, which is institutions and power, right? So is there an institution, and what is the distribution of power here? So that's again intervening, right? That interferes with how they interact. So to give an example, and that plays out really nicely, or not nicely, but it's pretty obvious in the example between Britain and the EU, or Switzerland and the EU, is that the EU is playing out its power because it has the big market, and it plays out its ability to restrict access to this market. So that's power, right? So power matters in this interaction, and it matters a lot. And whether we have an institution matters a lot. For instance, whether we have an institution like the WTO or the IMF matters for this interaction, right? So from here, we identified in our lecture the relevant variables, and we put them together like this, right? And this is the framework. This is often called the open economy politics framework. And that's a framework that we're going to use from the next session onwards to analyze different questions in international relations. What you need to should know is that we are going to highlight, we're not always going to look at everything. In the first week of trade, we're going to look at this. In the second week of trade, we're going to look at this. In the first week of monetary affairs, we're going to look at this. And in the second week, we're going to look at this. And sometimes we're going to highlight one factor more than the other, depending on what we think is the most interesting one to understand a phenomenon. Okay, so see you next time.
Why did the industries that were internationally wanted to be oriented became more important after the Great Depression?
Well, everybody, because agriculture and these sectors were much more affected by the Great Depression.
Oh, okay.
So everybody suffered, but international finance recovered much more quickly than the others.
And then it changed.
Exactly. Yeah. Hello. Zumindest die erste multilaterale war die IT-Themen, aber vielleicht regionale gab es vielleicht auch schon andere. Ja, die kam glaube ich ein bisschen später. Die kam 10 Jahre später, 5 Jahre später. Sehr einfach, keine politisch umstrittenen Themen, die da genau. Ja. After negotiations, but they let me just stay away. Or come over. Yeah. So they negotiated in the trade agreement with France lower tariffs. They did this because now exporting firms lobbied in the United States lobbied for this agreement. Before they did not. Because before it was unilateral. The US could lower tariffs and it did not affect what France does. Because it was unilateral. Now it's reciprocal. Now the exporters care about France, want lower tariffs in France, and France only lowers tariffs if the US lowers tariffs.
So it's an agreement
Exactly. It's an agreement.
to the foreign products to arrive in the US and the national product to arrive in
Exactly. So they don't specify how many products they can send. They just specify the tax.
So by tariff is a tax.
Yes, it's a tax on goods that happen to be paid. Yeah. Sure.
I've got a question about you mentioned issue linkage.
Yes. Yeah.
On the two-level game.
Yeah.
What's that exactly? I didn't get to
So you link different issues. So I have trade in agriculture. So you talk about the tariff in agriculture. And you talk about tariff in trade and services. And you can discuss them separately, or you can discuss them together.
Okay.
Issue linkage is that you discuss them together, and you have an agreement that either decides on both sides at the same time or nothing at all. So that's like the bilateral treaties with the EU. You discuss everything together, and you can accept or reject the whole package, but not free movement of people and so on. Yeah. So that means that we link issues where we have different interests. So you don't like free movement of people, but we want access to the European market. So we link the two, and then it's easier for you to accept free movement of people.
Yeah.
We just
Thank you very much.